The cropping and straightening of images, both horizontals and verticals, go hand in hand in Adobe Camera Raw. We have the ability to crop images in both Camera Raw and Photoshop, but it makes some sense to use Camera Raw and do the cropping and straightening prior to any editing. Let's select this image that does need some straightening, and I'll double click. Because it's a raw file, it will be intercepted by Camera Raw. And I'm going to go directly to my crop tool at the top right of the screen. Cropping helps us to enhance our composition, removes distractions around the edges, helps us to focus on the main centre of interest. It's a bit like fine-tuning our shot to enhance what matters most. We can also use cropping to adjust for certain aspect ratios. Let me demonstrate that first. This image is from a digital SLR, so the aspect ratio is 3:2. And you can see here it's shown as full, and the little padlock you can see there is locked. So if I pull in this toggle here, you'll notice all of the toggles come in together, because what it's doing there with that lock set is it's retaining the 3:2 aspect ratio. I'll hit the escape key and come away. One of the more common aspect ratios we'll use is 16:9. Well, we can select that from the preset. We can see that reflected in the different shape here, and we'll also notice that it locks the little padlock. So once again, no matter which of these toggles I use, it's going to retain that 16:9 aspect ratio. But of course, to adjust that, all I need to do is to select my 16:9, uncheck the little padlock, and now I've got the ability to crop in any way I see fit. And of course, we need to straighten the horizon as well. So once again, just for a moment, let me hit the escape key and let's look at straightening up the horizon behind the boat. There's a couple of ways we can do that. One of those is with this angle here, so you can do it by eye, or you can pick up this little option here. It says straighten tool, and all we do with this is to draw a line. And the line we draw is telling the software, please make that part straight. And as long as I uncheck my lock, I can then pick up my cropping from there. So I can decide to bring the base up as far as I feel it needs to. Maybe I could lose that little bit on the left here, that buoy. But once I'm happy with what I want to display, I can hit the enter key, and then we could continue with any other editing we wanted to do. Now I'm going to go back to my crop tool, and when I click that, you will notice that we haven't actually lost anything of our image. So once I have the crop shape, I can hit the escape key and we're right back to square one. So there's another way we can straighten that horizon. We can just do it purely manually. So if I was willing to leave the preset set to full and I just uncheck that little padlock, the first thing I could do is move my cursor outside. You'll see a little double-headed arrow. When I click, I get the grid and I can rotate. And if I have good judgment, I can probably line up that horizon pretty well in one go. Then I can bring up the bottom, which is what I wanted to do before, lose that little bit from the left, and we're back where we were. No rights and wrongs here. You choose whatever works for you. Now, just for the moment, let's assume that the editing we want to do in Camera Raw is done. I'm going to go down and click Open. This image is going to open up into Photoshop. There we have it, and if there was anything else we needed to do which was just required in Photoshop, we could go ahead. But what I'm actually going to do is to close this down. And I'm going to say no, I don't want to save it. Because if we go back into Bridge, and I'll do that from my bottom bar here, you'll see that the thumbnail now reflects the changes that we made. It tells me that the image has been cropped. So even though I could have opened this up into Photoshop, I could have saved the result as a Photoshop file, a TIFF file, a JPEG, it wouldn't affect this one at all. So at any time in the future, I can just double click that thumbnail, and because we're working on raw files, even now, any of the editing changes that I did, I could change. Well, we didn't do any of those, but even the crop is still something we can back away from. Now, once we do crop the image or make any changes, if we didn't want to open it up into Photoshop, but we wanted to retain the changes, just click the Done button down at the bottom right. And when you go back into Bridge, your changes will be waiting for you in that thumbnail. Now, as you can see here, a different image opened up into Camera Raw, and you can see in the light section on the right hand side, I've made a few changes. We'll be covering these in detail, don't worry, but for the moment, let's assume that I've completed all of the changes and I want to open this up into Photoshop. Now, once it opens into Photoshop, I could save it and in a day or so think, maybe I made a mistake, I should have cropped that. Well, we've got two options. We could go back to the thumbnail in Bridge. Now, as we look at the thumbnail in Bridge, that little symbol tells us that some editing has been done. So all I'd need to do is double click. It will open up into Adobe Camera Raw and I could make the crop. But let's crop it in Photoshop. So in Photoshop, I'm going to pick up my crop tool here and you'll see the crop shape appears. And if I just click inside the image, you'll see the rule of thirds also appears. Now we've got the same sort of options we had in Adobe Camera Raw. We've got the opportunity for a fixed aspect ratio, but if these values are clear, we can just do what I would call a freehand crop. So here, if you notice, mostly the base of this image doesn't have much going for it. It's not adding much to the image. So we can just drag up from the bottom and we could reassess our composition. There we've got the rule of thirds nicely. I could actually bring this in to put the house a little bit closer to this area here, which is a strong point. You get the idea, and there is lots of personal choice here as well as some rules to follow. Now, if you look up at the top of the screen, you'll also notice that we get a little box and it says, do we want to delete the crop pixels? I tend to leave that ticked because if I'm cropping in Photoshop, I know I'm deleting what I'm cropping away, but you don't have to. If you want to untick that, save this as a Photoshop file, you can change that crop sometime later. But here, I'm just going to touch the Enter key or go to the Done button at the top right, and there's the crop made in Photoshop. Now, I can't think of too much more that I'd like to add about cropping at the moment, but let's just finish quickly with this image here. I'm going to open this up into Adobe Camera Raw and go straight to my crop, because there are times when we may want to turn a landscape into a portrait format. Now, we can do that manually just by picking up the toggles and moving them, but if we go to this icon here, we can just rotate the aspect ratio. Well, because this is a 3:2 format image and the preset has picked that up, when I do that, the crop shape retains 3:2. Now, if that's what we wanted, fine. If not, then just make sure that your padlock is unlocked and you can tweak these as well. But if we kept it at something like 3:2, then we can click inside, move the image until we've got near perfect composition. The tower straight up that rule of thirds line on the left, and the people very close to that strong crossover position, and all we would need to do here is to hit the Enter key, and there we have it. Once the editing is complete, of course, as usual, we would open the image into Photoshop. In the next video, we're going to look at saving our images because there's rather a lot of different options. What do we choose and why?